Welcome to the Firebeast Times, a podcast working to uplift internationalist dialogues on human rights, climate change, and visions of bold futures. We're part of the From the Periphery Media Collective, and you can support us by going to patreon.com/From the Periphery, or just search From the Periphery on Apple Podcasts. You'll get early access to all podcasts, exclusive audio and video episodes, and an invitation to join our monthly hangouts and more. If you're already subscribed, thank you. Please leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcast, share our episodes, and tell your friends about them. Hello, everyone. I'm Layla. I'm your host today, and I have with me Elia as a co-host and also Banah, who I will hand over to introduce themselves.
Yay! I'm so happy to join you all. I'm so happy to be here and honored. And my name is, I guess, Dr. Banah Al-Ghadban, or as I like to go by, Al-Ghadbana. And I teach comparative women's studies at Spelman College. And I study, the creative work of Syrian women.
Yeah, and thank you for doing this, you two. I'm happy to join.
Thanks for having me.
Of course.
It's great to have you here.
And this is the second time we have Banah on, of course. I'll link the previous episode in our show notes.
And so we decided to have you on following an article that you wrote last month in Spectre Journal called Give Us Our Land Back, the Golan Heights Greenwashing, Syria and Palestine's Intertwined Revolutions, which we're going to talk about today. But just to start, what made you decide to write this article?
So I've been working on this for quite some time because I felt like there were some gaps in leftist social movements that I was organizing in around understanding Syria, Palestine, and Lebanon's interconnectedness. And it's called Give Us Our Land Back, because I also felt like people were missing the entire point sometimes that this is a struggle about land and indigenous land. And I kind of use this sort of eco-feminist analysis to understand that, there's a particular orientation that that Syrian, Palestinian, Lebanese people have toward their land. And I kind of connect it to this bigger concept that I'm just trying to articulate around Shemia feminisms, as opposed to maybe Arab feminisms, not as opposed to, actually very much a part of and in conversation with, but the idea being that first there's non-Arab people on our lands and also Arabs with minority ethno-religious kinds of positionings that uniquely situate them within Zionism that should be accounted for, that might get overlooked in an Arab framing. But that's not to discount the usefulness of Arabness. I think Arab nationalism is triggering for a lot of Syrians as we see what our own regime has done in the name of Arab nationalism and fighting colonization and the kinds of abuses it's justified. So I wanted to have multiple layers of critique simultaneously, like the anti-authoritarian, the anti-colonial, the anti-patriarchal, the anti-capitalist, and the anti-environmental, destruction lens all together at once.
And you start the article sharing what I imagine comes from your own frustration that on social media, since the war began on Gaza, we've seen so many people sharing pictures from Syria of bombed out areas in Syria, or children that were injured in Syria, and saying that these were pictures coming out of Gaza. And especially frustrating when some of those people are people that either mocked or denied what was happening in Syria. They support Palestine, but they weren't able to extend that same support to people in Syria.
Yeah, Exactly. And I was coming across that same kind of consciousness in organizing spaces. And I think it's hugely important in moments when images go viral to always contextualize them, and that a lot can be understood when we actually talk about the misrecognition and the differences. So as you said, I was noticing, this photo set from Yarmouk, from Little Palestine Diary of a Siege by Abdullah al-Khatib, which many Syrians might be familiar with and Palestinians, but I don't think people in the global north or even leftist organizing spaces around the world might understand the context of Assad's siege on Yarmouk refugee camp. And Yarmouk refugee camp is the largest Palestinian refugee camp in the world, and it's on the outskirts of Damascus. And there were particular kinds of solidarities being forged and fought for, and that people like Khalil Bakrawi and others gave their lives for, to show that they were fighting both the Assad regime and Zionism. And so when I saw those circulated without context, I mean, I could go on a whole vent about Syrian viral images from Syria and the harm that they've caused, because they play a particular role also of creating like a pitied refugee who's depoliticized, who's not an agent of their own liberation, who wasn't displaced because of politics. So I wanted to focus on that moment and just also recognize that, like, my friends from Gaza, even before this current iteration of the genocide, always told me that if you walked on the streets of Gaza, people more than anywhere in the world would understand Syria. Like, there was a solidarity between Gaza and Syria because there's a particular experience of having entire neighborhood blocks bombed that it's like they understood. And I have one friend that told me, like, even though we have these issues and social movements in the global north around Syria and Palestine and the misrecognition of the Syrian movement, he was expressing to me that if you were to go to Gaza, like on the ground today, people would understand Syria's revolution more than anything, like from a materialist place. So I also felt like that consciousness was missing, that there was some kind of shared experience. And of course, it's different, and those differences must be discussed. But it is a way of understanding each other that people were not knowledgeable about.
It's important. When the Arab Spring started, I was living in Palestine and I was spending a lot of time in Gaza. And definitely I felt so much support. People were always asking, what's happening? How's your family? I really felt that. And it was only through doing kind of the internationalist solidarity work that I saw a very different side of the Palestine movement, of people that would discredit what was happening in Syria. But yeah, I think there's such a shared understanding between Palestinians in Gaza and Syrians. And also we've seen since October the 7th, so much solidarity coming out of Syria, people at demonstrations holding the Palestinian flag. In Idlib, they've done a whole square in the Palestinian colours. So there's definitely a mutual understanding and mutual solidarity between people on the ground, but unfortunately that's not translated into other circles.
I had Muhammad Sulaiman on 2 or 3 years ago. It's one of the episodes that we would re-released, I think around December. He was born and raised in Gaza, currently in Australia, or at least when we recorded was in Australia. And I specifically had him on because he was talking a lot about the Assad regime on Twitter at the time. And he very explicitly told me that I can tell you and I can guarantee you that very few people in Gaza have any sympathies whatsoever towards Bashar al-Assad. And Rifat al-Arir, obviously many people would know him now, unfortunately, especially after he was assassinated in December in Gaza, repeatedly tweeted that Bashar al-Assad is as monstrous as all of the Israeli leaders and all stuff like that. if we kind of forget sort of the other context that the three of us are familiar with as well, like when Syria being erased, Syrian voices being erased, Yarmouk basically never being even talked about and stuff like that, or if it is talked about in conspiracy theory terms. If we forget all of this and we just think about like, well, of course they will think that. Of course, most people who live under a brutal siege and blockade, who are also, part of the same historical community, who have like intimate ties with Syrians, and so on and so forth. Of course, they're going to see the obvious parallels between a bombed out, neighborhood in Halab, like in Aleppo, or obviously in Gaza. Like, why wouldn't they? And that I try and remind myself of this a lot of the time, because those are not the people that are currently dominating the airspaces and the discourse, quote unquote, of course, which, we'll get into, of course. But yeah, I just wanted to add that.
And of course, that disconnect is so much perpetuated by the Syrian regime, because the Syrian regime itself uses Palestine to boost its popularity. It presents itself as a defender of the Palestinian cause, as an axis of resistance, but that's very different from how it itself treats Palestinian populations, which is something you also talk about, Banah, in your essay.
Yeah, and I think both of you are pointing to that a lot of us and a lot of people who are in the region right now, from Blad al-Sham or the Levant, have a bodily knowledge, like an intimate knowledge of the layers of generational violence, but also of the political systems that caused those violence. And so in that layeredness comes a critique. And I think that's where some, feminist like methodologies are useful. Like I think of Theory of the Flesh by Gloria Anzaldúa and Sherry Moraga, that like if you were grounded in the flesh and the bodies of people who were experiencing these things, and even in its diaspora and the implications these political systems have created in terms of displacement, then from that place, the critique would automatically include an awareness of the interconnectedness. But so many people are not coming from the theory of the flesh. They're coming from being on Twitter and being in really kind of like, mind-centered places where it's about analysis. So yeah, if you look at the experience of Palestinians in Syria, that will tell you everything you need to know about the interconnectedness of these systems of violence. The ways that Palestinians in Syria were treated as second-class citizens under both Hafez al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad's regimes, the ways that they were tortured, imprisoned, and then, massacred, and also had their struggle co-opted by the same person abusing them, claiming to fight for their liberation. And that in itself is why they get so silenced. Because as you said, I think the propaganda of the regime is so strong, even in the left. And also I want to point out that among Syrians too, because of some of these failures, I've also noticed like a regression where they feel like, oh, no one's paid attention to us. Why should we care now about Palestine? And it's so harmful. It's so disrespectful to our, again, theories of the flesh and like embodied knowledges and histories. Even if you're not Palestinian in Syria, Zionist occupation is on your land. Even if you're not Palestinian in Syria, like my own family, fought for Palestine because it was a collective struggle that everyone before basically the first Camp David, it was like a united Arab struggle, and we've lost that. And of course, the Zionists use that, and they try to dismiss Palestinians and dismiss the usage of the term Palestine and kind of invisibilize them and say this is an Arab thing. But we actually have lost the greater solidarity, and it's due to the failure of our regimes.
I genuinely believe that one of the core tenets of, for lack of a better term, Assadism, authoritarianism a la Syria, authoritarianism as practiced by the Assad regime, first the father and then the son, is a structural anti-Palestinianism. There's something profoundly anti-Palestinian from the get-go, from the start, from the early 1970s, about first Hafez al-Assad and then Bashar al-Assad. And Palestine was always at best a rhetorical device, a tool to be used whenever convenient at the local level, and also in terms of this international posturing that it has as like the anti-imperialist state or whatever, in quotation, all of this. And this makes it one of the reasons I find so... Okay, it's a quick backtrack and I'll explain what I mean, and I try not to spend too much time on this specific point, but as someone who's from Lebanon and who comes from this very specific positionality of being both against the Israeli state project, blah, 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 and the Syrian one, specifically the Assadist one. We lost Ilyas Khouri just a few days ago, and he was one of the embodiments as well of this understanding that it's almost artificial to separate Syria and Palestine. When we talk about the way these authoritarian regimes practice their authoritarianism, practice their power, they have always learned from one another. In Lebanon, they have quite literally co-occupied Lebanon militarily for a good couple of decades. We, of course, hear a lot about the Israeli one, not unreasonably so. It was very brutal between 1982 and 2000. But the Syrian one ran parallel to this. And from 1976 to 2005, on and off, they quite literally carved out Lebanon because it was convenient for them to do so. And as you mentioned yourself in the piece, actually, the first big invasion of Lebanon was in 1976, and it was by the Hafez al-Assad's regime in order to protect the same establishment, the same sectarian elites embodied by the phalangists, especially the Kataib, that Israel would later intervene and invade again in 1982 to protect them once again. And who was their enemy in both cases? It was the Palestinian resistance and the Lebanese national movement, some communists here and there and whatnot. And both Hafez al-Assad and the Israeli establishment both found those to be the enemy. They agreed on who the enemy is. And it is what it is. And for me, it's very revealing.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is really important, that we have to talk about Lebanon and, you know, the ways that the Syrian regime has terrorized Palestinians, Syrians, and Lebanese people. Like, that is part of this Shamiyya, Blad al-Sham consciousness. I'm trying to share that, you know, this is beyond like Syrian nationalism, Lebanese nationalism, or Palestinian nationalism. Like, our people have a specific Blad al-Sham sovereignty and ties to our land that is disrupted, and that we're displaced by because of authoritarianism and colonialism working together. And I also want to point out just the role of class in all of this. I think that's like a thing that's missing in a lot of leftist spaces that don't understand the Syrian regime. They don't understand the ways that this became an oligarchy that is a ruling class that like has so much economic and military power in the region, even if they're kind of positioned as the underdogs or something in this fight somehow. They have so much structural power, and it's so ironic because the entire point of this in the post-colonial moment after the French left was to redistribute the sectarian hierarchies that the French created among Alawite and Sunni people, you know, by allowing this man who came from a peasant Alawite background to be president. This was like supposed to be a powerful thing. And then you saw him terrorize the Falah peasant people, the Kurdish people, the Palestinian people, the Lebanese people, basically everyone who weren't the upper Syrian city-dwelling elite. And I hate to say it like this, but like there's also a role that displacement plays here. Like, I'm a child of people who fled Syria in the 80s and the 70s. And there's a whole generation like me who grew up their whole lives feeling crazy because we only met Syrians who were pro-regime, in the cities, because their life was never impacted the way that the other classes were by the regime. So there's a lot of invisible things happening here that people are unaware of. And the story of Lebanon is one of them. The way that the Assad regime facilitated heinous massacres and played such a huge role in occupying Lebanon it's exactly speaking to the moment that we're in right now too. And I wish people understood that. That's what's so ironic about like the racist attacks on Syrians in Lebanon. It's like, they're being displaced by the same powers that oppressed you, right? So it doesn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't. It's nationalism, and really does in this specific case. But
Yeah.
I mean,
don't want
Palestinians in Lebanon were also treated so badly
Mhm.
in the refugee camps, despite the rhetoric of Palestine. Their situation's very bad.
It's the same playbook that has just been recycled and applied at Syrians. Really.
Yeah,
They say so.
yeah.
The Gibran Basir, leader of the Free Patriotic Movement, and all of those other viciously anti-Palestinian figures, they explain their anti-Syrianism, by which I mean anti-Syrian refugees, because they're fine with the Assad regime, by evoking their anti-Palestinianism. Like, they make those links all the time.
Mhm. There's this tactic that I kind of mentioned in the article that Hafez al-Assad's troops used in Lebanon, which was, this is extremely graphic, but it's called the falkh, or splitting of Palestinians. And they literally were using these kinds of methods of brutality that we see the Zionist state using, like tearing people's bodies apart. And that's why I brought up Nadera Shalhoub-Kevorkian, because she has a whole theory about how Zionism scatters and tears the flesh apart, and that's part of their project, is to destroy people's bodies and also fracture them from their lands, fragment them, rip them from their roots. And I think when we talk about like the farmers and the farmers in the Golan, that I mentioned in the article, that like are using apple growing and cherry growing and waterways as a way to resist colonization, and also Syrians using roses, even now in Sueda, in this majority Druze area, which is a lot like the Golan, in that the Golan is also majority Druze. Like, they are using flowers and like passing out grapes. And this might seem trivial, but it is a way to resist that tearing apart of the body mind land.
And of course, in the Golan, so much of the Israeli occupation has been around control over resources and denying people access to their land, access to their water resources. That's a big factor in it.
Yeah, I think the work of Mona Dejani is really important, because she writes about the waterways of the Golan, and Israel gets 1/3 of its water from Israel, whatever, the so-called state of Israel gets it from the Golan, because they're at the head of these tributaries, and they export this spring water to all of Europe, like, and these companies like Eden Springs and the other ones I mentioned say that they're using one of the first, ethical climate action, carbon neutral, I don't know, strategies to do so. But the entire siege on the Golan in the 80s, they cut off the waterways, that was a big part of it. And so residents of the Golan dug alternative irrigation systems and sewage systems in resistance to this. And there was also a way that like the education system, the Zionist entity, was trying to co-opt the Druze people and say that they were not Arab and that they were not Syrian, like they did to people inside of the borders, that they did to Palestinian Druze people. So they started changing the textbooks and saying that this is part of the, indigenous Israeli land, and the people of Golan created alternative curricula and pedagogies and had like underground kindergartens and underground sports camps, and you just saw the fierce ties of the land and of the people to the land. And I talk about this wind turbine project that's going on now, where they've tried to convince the Syrian farmers of Golan to give up the last 5% of their land to build a sustainable, renewable energy wind turbine project. And farmers are harassed, and extorted essentially by these companies to force them to hand over their land, and they won't. Even when we saw the children in Golan who were bombed and killed while playing soccer, you saw the Israelis, Netanyahu himself, coming to Golan and trying to normalize and trying to exploit and triangulate them and say that we're in solidarity with you. And the people of Golan ran him out and said he was, barbaric, and that they refuse.
Yeah, and if I remember, one man was interviewed and specifically said that the only thing that this benefits is Netanyahu and Hassan Nasrallah, and he was one of the people in the Golan being interviewed right after the fact, right after the attack that killed those 12, I believe, kids. Of course, I can't not mention there is a law prohibiting specific types of foraging, including I have it here like ayoub, za'atar, and so on. And there is a defiance by obviously a lot of folks who are from the land to ignore the law and have to constantly pay fines and stuff like that, but they're wanting to continue to do so. Controlling the land has always been an extension of controlling bodies and so on. And you yourself, of course, Banah, you mentioned the Assadist equivalence of this in that sense of flooding entire areas and stuff like that. The Kurdish areas especially, to make way for these grand projects which authoritarian governments tend to be quite obsessed with.
Yeah, it reminds me of Omar Amiralai's film A Flood in Bath Country. And he originally was hired by the regime to do propaganda. And then through interviewing these villagers who were displaced by these modernization projects that flooded and destroyed their lands, he became politicized against the regime. So then he made this film about, in the early 2000s, the flooding of rural farm working land. And that's something my own family, who were rural farm workers, experienced. They had a system from Roman times in their daya, with irrigation tunnels from the Romans. So they had it really well organized on how to share water. They've done this for thousands of years. And the regime in the 70s and 80s, confiscated a lot of the water sites, like the springs, and then that thousands-year-old irrigation system that was very sustainable and had to do with sharing. You had a specific time of day when the water came on and to water your crops, and there was a Natur that was in charge of making sure everyone used their water minutes, and you could donate your extra water minutes to another farmer family if you needed that. So it was really cooperative. It was really socialist. Everyone got the same, but you could share if you opted to do that. So the regime destroyed that delicate indigenous farming practice by polluting the rivers, mismanaging the land, and also doing mass land grabs of Falah farmers' lands. And I have to mention the Lake Assad project in 1973. I didn't even know about this. I should have known more. That's my Arab privilege. I didn't even know that they drowned 66 Kurdish villages. The Assad regime displaced 332 villages and drowned 66 because of this Arab development.
The Arabization of the area.
And it did remind me of Gamal Abdel Nasser and the Nubians and the building of the Aswan Dam and like the use of water to colonize and to further displace people from their.
And that's something we see so clearly in the Golan as well, because most of the population was pushed out of the Golan. Only 5 Arab Druze villages remained, and most of the water is diverted for agricultural settlements. And the people of those villages who work from agriculture and work the land have very little access to water because they cannot develop their own resources and infrastructure. Their wells are drying up, and they have to pay more for water than the Israeli settlements in the region, and have much stricter quotas on how much they can use. So it is this policy of really using the water to make it untenable for people to stay on that land, really.
Yeah, exactly. And I mentioned this, phrase from Jolani farmers who call it the rape of our groundwater, the ways that they couldn't even collect the rain that fell on their land, and even despite that, they still try to build rainwater tanks and alternative irrigation systems. And I mentioned how there are these projects in the 80s to bring Palestinian students to the Jolan from Birzeit University to show them how to build water tanks as a form of resistance and how to move soil from the valleys to the mountains when you're restricted with water so that you can grow apples and things, So these stories of solidarity are also land-based. Like, I don't have my dad's farm anymore. So how am I going to teach, I don't know, all this random knowledge I have about water and like irrigation system that I don't even have a fraction of what my family that were on the ground had. Like, where does all that knowledge go? And how can we carry that across diasporas too and exchange,
This conversation's reminding me of a book that I read fairly recently, The Land in Our Bones, which
I love that. She's one of my good friend, my sisters.
It's a wonderful book. It spoke so powerfully to me, that book, because I live on a small holding, so I'm involved. I grow food here, and raising those issues of what the connection to the land means and what those herbs mean to people in the diaspora, and the conversations that we've been having now about how using protection of the land and growing as a form of resistance, how important that is.
Yes, yeah, I cite her book when I say that the roses are a plantcestor, like Leila Ferrari, created or kind of named this term plantcestor in The Land in Our Bones to mean like the land is our ancestor, and the land is also like we take care of the land and it takes care of us. And so when we have that splitting apart of our bodies from the land, it is akin to kind of like they were saying, like the rape of our groundwater. It's like an assault, like of a sexual nature. It's like a pulling of the roots, and it's so violent. And I think that's why it's so beautiful to me. I mean, and I don't mean this at all to romanticize it, because I was privy to some of the conversations in Syria's revolution about using roses. But I think that the roses, and you wrote about this, Leila, too, about the use of roses. It's just so, it's a tool, it's a technology. Like, I call it a technology because to reach toward the earth when you're being bombed and shot at and terrorized, to reach toward a flower and to center that plantcestor. And in Sweden today, like, I just look on the Facebook pages and I watch the women and the men holding roses every Friday, and no one is talking about this. Like, it's still happening, and they're standing behind a statue of Sultan al-Atrash, the first leader of the first Syrian revolution against the French, and they're holding roses. Like, that's so significant for people across Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine that have been so brutally torn from their lands, to hold that. And in the early Rezan Zaytuna, who we know is like kidnapped and we don't know if she's dead or alive, but she wrote about the roses too. And she wrote that it was really controversial for people to hold the roses. Like people were criticizing it. Like this is some really silly stuff to do in the face of such brutality. Why would you do this? This is not effective. Like, and those early activists like Yahya Shirbaji, Ghiyath Matar, Islam Dabbas, they were, some of them Palestinian Syrians also, were brutally killed and tortured, you know, for holding these roses. And I think that like the things they left behind for us, like when I watch videos of Yahya Shirbaji and how passionately he was talking about the roses, I think that's another thing I wasn't finding in social justice spaces that I was in, is that connection to earth. And also one last thing is just, what was I going to say? Oh, Yahya Shirbaji, those same youth who came up with the rose idea were part of the coordination committee of Dareya, who were early in the activists in the early 2000s that fought against US imperialism of Iraq. And they were actually imprisoned by the Assad regime for doing those protests in the 2000s. So they also did street cleaning and anti-bribery campaigns. So those are the people who come up with roses, you know, the ones that are anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, anti-regime, and just pro like environmentalism. And I think we all have something to learn from that.
Definitely.
I had written an essay called An Idea Called Daraya years ago now. For for Jamhuriya. Like, I think it was like 2016.
It was a beautiful essay, that one.
Thank you. But just to say that, like, it was one of the attempts. I think your piece, and obviously Layla's work regularly does that too, of like preserving a very specific thing that myself, while I was writing this, felt like it can disappear very quickly if not talked about. If not that I was the only one doing it, obviously, but that was like my impulse. I'm wondering, like, if we can talk a bit more about the centrality of, like, what would centering Yarmouk look like, or how would that change one's analysis? Let's put it that way, as a way of reflecting. Tell me if this makes sense. On, I think the frustration that the three of us share towards this like segment of the international left that is often very vocal on Palestine, and it has this very obvious, I think to the three of us, problem when it comes to Palestine and Syria, Yarmouk, obviously, to put it that way.
This siege, well, first of all, from just hearing experiences of friends that grew up in Yarmouk and the kinds of organizing that happened there, like it has always been a hub of political consciousness. And the marches that I mentioned, like that were happening in 2011, were part of a larger Blad al-Sham march on the borders in Lebanon, in Syria, and Syrian, Palestinian, and Lebanese people marched toward these Zionist artificial borders. And, you know, Yarmouk was under siege from 2012 to 2014, in which, you know, the regime bombed them and launched chemical rain, and there were no medical supplies or food coming in, and people were starving. And it just mirrors this year of and I don't want to conflate two things because it is very different, but it just mirrors Gaza so much, and the fact that they're both Palestinian populations who are enduring this extreme kind of siege and starvation, siege and genocide. It was a genocide. And I think that viral photo I talk about, like those kids were saying, I dream of having bread, you know, and people thought that those were children from Gaza today. So there was a level of deprivation and the usage of tactics by the Assad regime that Rezan Zawi posted about this, that they were saying, like, where do you think the Assad regime learned that from? That's all from Israel. Like, where do you think they're taking notes from, in terms of how to starve and siege and genocide of people? So Yarmouk has to be at the center of this consciousness. And I brought up even, before that siege, people like Tal Malouhi who aren't even Palestinian, but they're Syrians in solidarity with the failures of Assad's regime on Palestinians. And like she goes to jail for writing about those failures, about the failures of the Arab state to protect Palestine.
And this was before the revolution, that she was imprisoned.
Yeah, that was in 2009, and she was only 17, and she was the youngest prisoner of conscience in the world. And I also think like the existence of branch 235, the Palestine branch, in the prison system, it initially was created it was called the Palestine branch because they were fighting Israeli spies and would send them there. So it was for Palestine. But then, ironically, it became notorious for the torture of Palestinians, and Syrians. And it's one of the most notorious branches of the military intelligence, which is only one arm of a 15-branch military and security apparatus, each one with different kinds of prisons and different offices. And so Palestinians in Syria, there's the Action Group for Palestinians of Syria, and they document how many Palestinians are taken. And even just on a personal level, like when I went to Palestinian refugee, I went with Palestinian youth movement to Greece when in 2016 the EU-Turkey deal was happening, and they were trying to deport all of the Syrians, and that left Palestinian Syrians in a really hard place because they weren't even considered real refugees, but then they were, being deported back to Turkey and just being put at risk after they had experienced all these layers of violence. And I met this young man from Gaza that his grandparents were from Gaza and then displaced by the Zionists. His parents grew up in Yarmouk refugee camp and then they were displaced. And then he grew up in Daraa and he was part of the revolution in Daraa. So it's like you see in the lives of Palestinian Syrians, like what I was talking about, that somatic knowledge of multiple generations of authoritarian and colonial violence simultaneously. And Yarmouk shows us that again and again.
And many Palestinians from Yarmouk referred to what happened to Yarmouk as a second Nakba for them, because they were forcibly displaced. I think it was April 2018 when the regime retook control of the camp, and everybody that was left in the camp was pushed out. And until today, the vast majority of them cannot return. And another similarity with Israel is the way that the Syrian regime uses housing, land and property laws to confiscate and expropriate the property of the original inhabitants and transfer it over, in this case, to regime loyalists for development, but in a way that the original inhabitants, those who oppose the regime, are never able to return back to their homes. And it's these things, if you look at the law number 10, which was one of the laws that has been used to confiscate property, it's very, very similar to the absentee property law that Israel used to take land off Palestinians.
At the time when the Syrian one was passed, there were Palestinian commentators, I remember, including Yusuf Mnayir. I remember specifically saying basically this looks familiar. This feels familiar, because of course it is.
Exactly. And I think this is back to the title, Give Us Our Land Back. Like, this is about land. I think people keep forgetting, especially in the global north, in some spaces I've been in, people sometimes forget that this is a struggle over land, and we get so lost in the semantics. And even just to understand Zionist colonization, it's they want to steal the land and they want to take people's bodies off of the land. And I think this scale of displacement, Palestine created the template for that, like the amount of displaced Palestinians there are and the generations we see. And I mentioned, like, as a Syrian growing up, and I didn't know there were other Syrians that were forcibly displaced because that generation was mostly lost and tortured, and very few kind of made it out. But then once 2011 happened, I saw the scale of a new diaspora, and like it's these interwoven diasporas now that we also have to talk about, like what happens to the movement, what happens to our people when you are displaced in these ways, like what does it do generationally? And also now we become racialized in other spaces. Like I'm looked at as a Latino woman. Like, what does that mean? You know what I mean? Or like you might be considered white now in some spaces, or, like, so I also really care about the work of like connecting racialization, even though people are wary of doing that, because we also don't want to project US centric frameworks of racialization. But and we also don't want to get a little sloppy. And like, there's been, some Syrians that say like there's Black and white Syrians, or they use that in a symbolic way when those are actually racial terms in Europe and the North that hold different weight. But I think of this project we did during the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor uprisings called Syrians for Black Power. And it was basically a video of Palestinian Syrians from Yarmouk, Assyrian Syrians, Armenian Syrians, and Alawite Syrians for the revolution who came together and were in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. And I think of like Aziz al-Asmar in Binish, Idlib, making these big murals for Palestine, for Gaza, and also for George Floyd. And like, what does that mean when we not only connect Blad al-Sham together, but we connect to other movements, to Black and Native movements that we're now, because of our displacement, and always have been in a way because of migration, like are implicated in, and also because we live in this world where these systems are global.
I mean, it seems so obvious to me that we should be connecting all these different struggles, and, there's space to hold all these multiple oppressions. But I don't know why we're still in a situation where for some people it just seems so difficult to do that. Like so many people cannot seem to support both Syria and Palestine struggles together, even though these aren't, it's not like George Floyd and Syria, which are actually quite distant from each other. They're part of the same, history, part of the same culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I talk to Syrians, like who had just fled from protests, and talk to them about police brutality in the US, they would say things like, I thought Syria was the only place where the police like gun you down, like there's these connections that are, again, like from the flesh and from these experiences that are, I think, the key to our liberation and the map to our movement.
I feel hopeful though, with having such a big diaspora population, that there's much more potential for those connections to be made amongst populations in the diaspora. We're coming into contact with each other. It's a microcosm of the world if you go to Berlin or certain areas. So maybe there's hope that from those spaces, something new can be born.
Would you say from the peripheries?
Exactly.
Yeah, and also like we said, sometimes, it's just like the diaspora. Sometimes we just get in these silly little wars with each other that, again, like if you were to listen to someone on the ground in Gaza and go back to your friends and family on the ground, sometimes, yeah, we just need that grounding and have to center like those experiences, because that's what I just find so hard, is like the kind of, yeah, like you said, Leila, one or the other, like, oh, either I can do Syria or Palestine. Like that's when the diaspora needs to, shut the F up and just kind of listen to like just, yeah. And I'll reserve my full rant about like the Twitter world. I'm not even there, but there are certain leftists that have now become complete authorities, like knowledge and the privilege of speaking and like narrating the genocide in Gaza has been given to them. They're not even Palestinian, they're not even Syrian, and they're not even I don't know, experts. Like I don't know their credentials other than that they are journalists and they're on Twitter but
They don't have credentials. I mean, it's amazing that they can take up so much space because they have nothing whatsoever to commend them to the region or this analysis.
Yeah. And those same people have been narrating like almost for us. It's like this kind of leftist imperialism where they're narrating with authority that, Syria and Palestine are separate. And it's not fair to us. And they're normalizing with Assad, and they're kind of doing this hierarchy of oppression that it's just not their role to do, and yet they're given so much power and authority to do it.
I do think there is such a thing as the imperial left, the colonial left, white. I mean, we know white left, for example. That's a term that is more familiar. Aimé Césaire complained about this in the 60s. Fanon talked about this in the 50s, 60s, I don't remember. And so in and of itself, even that is not particularly new. I think now it's just that plus the more modern phenomenon of like whoever has the loudest persona online and is less, literally, I think, more shameless because it's about posting as much as possible, regardless of whether it's accurate or not, the most outrageous possible, even the less care about sensitivities, like, you don't care about which images you're sharing, them, no matter how gory it is or video, you don't think about these things because ultimately it's about the engagement, quote unquote, or whatever. I also don't want to spend too much time on these people because they piss me off so much. But I wonder, as a way of also kind of slowly coming to a close to wrapping up, because I would love, of course, like for the final words to be Banah's here. I do also have some hope, like Laila, you've mentioned this. I mean, in many ways, this entire project just exists as a consequence of me becoming part of the diaspora. I met Laila as another member of the diaspora, a different one, but also not so different, and so on and so forth. And I found out, like, although I was, I raised in Lebanon and in Lebanon up until the moment I left for my studies, although obviously there were many more Syrians in Lebanon than those I met in London at the time, the power differential was no longer the same. And that made a huge difference. Because in Lebanon, despite my best efforts, despite my politics, despite all of this, I come from a background, there's all of those social structures that I can ignore as much as I want to as an activist and leftist and all of that stuff. But it doesn't change the fact that the vast majority of Syrians are effectively ghettoized in those so-called refugee camps, makeshift tents, essentially. They're not allowed, of course, to have any kind of structure that can even resemble something permanent. And this goes back, again, I mentioned before that this was applied to Palestinians initially, and Palestinians to this day in refugee camps have these ridiculous laws and layers of them of like, what can you build? Like, oh, you can use plastic, but not, I'm making things up here, but like not cotton or stuff like that. And that was just recycled to Syrians. But I'm saying this because when I got to that in a different space, physically, going back to like flesh theory, I was now surrounded by Palestinians, Syrians, some Palestinians who were born and raised in Lebanon, for that matter. And suddenly we were almost like we're all diaspora now. Like, it's not that where you come from doesn't matter. Of course it does. But it's like the power differentials within the system that I grew up in, which in this case is Lebanon, and in other people's cases would be Syria and so on, were like, we can cast them aside, at least temporarily, in order to get to know one another. And actually, this is how I got to know more about Yarmouk. This is where I met folks who were from Yarmouk and who introduced me to this, at the time, felt very kind of almost like an open secret of like how much there is resentment and sadness, I should say, towards the, for lack of a better term, global Palestine movement. because they, of course, view themselves as Palestinians. Their parents and grandparents are Palestinians. Some of them have still direct connections and relatives in Palestine, in Gaza included for that matter. And they felt very alienated from the movement because it's almost like Yarmouk doesn't matter. And yet Sabra and Shatila matters for good reasons, obviously, but not Tel Za'atar as much. And this is, that was part of your essay as well. So I'm trying to just hold this in many ways because it's not easy to do, as maybe my ramblings shows. But it's still, it feels very important to do so because there's these layers of erasures that end up severing the links between the destruction and massacre of people in Yarmouk and the destruction and massacre of Tel Za'atar, destruction and massacre in Sabra Shatila, which was in that case also an act of genocide, and obviously the destruction and massacre and ongoing genocide in Gaza today. Even though the tactics are fairly similar, the technology changes, the intentions are more or less similar. And in those specific cases, the people being victimized are more or less the same people. Some almost like literally in some cases that there are people who were, of course, Palestinian Syrian refugees, as in like they were themselves refugees from modern Israel, who got into Yarmouk and then after 2011 became refugees in Lebanon. And they became double refugees, and that's how they called them. And those people hold all of those experiences just in their day-to-day, before even politics enters the fray, so to speak. It's just, this is life.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's just such an interesting place. Like I talk about this a lot, and not academically, but in poetry, like how, all the great Arab poets talk about exile and the new consciousness, but also the painful, irreversible state that it creates. And it's like a satellite state, like you're always orbiting around, and things that you didn't see because of the level of segregation among class and ethno-religious groups and the invisible ways the systems position us against each other in the bled, in the homelands. When you enter diaspora, like even in early Syrian organizing in Turkey, like as a youth, I remember I had never, in our very insular, religiously conservative Syrian family community spaces in diaspora, like I had never met like an Assyrian Syrian. And suddenly I was meeting a Syrian anarchist feminist who like smoked weed. And I was like, I didn't know you could exist. Or I was meeting a Kurdish like street philosopher, or I was meeting like Circassian women. I had never heard of that ethnic group. And I think that if we had grown up alongside each other in Syria, I would have never heard of them because we would have been kept so disparate. And my family would have stayed insular in their laya, and I would have never met these other members of society and classes and sects in society who then taught me their struggle that I had never heard about before, in detail and like understood. And similarly, like I wouldn't have known Palestinian Syrians. I would have been like privileged in relationship to them because I wouldn't have. Well, actually, that's interesting because a lot of like the Fallah Syrians kind of went in and out of, from what I understand, like had like a class solidarity with the ways that Palestinians were ghettoized and forced into these camps. But yeah, when you enter diaspora, it's we get a little lost because we lose our footing in our relationships to the homeland. And we forget to center people on the ground. And then also, though, we're kind of in a new floating orbit with other satellite moons and planets that were not visible to us before. And again, that's like other ethnic groups beyond our region. Like my newest kind of thing I've been sharing about and doing workshops about is just kind of Black, African American, and Shamiya, Blad Sham, like Lebanon, Syria, Palestine solidarity history. And it's so deep. And I had no idea, like it's over a century of African American and Pan-African solidarity with the Levant. Like, people talk about Fatima Bernawi, who was an Afro-Palestinian woman that was the first to be imprisoned, but they don't know that her father came from Nigeria to fight the British during the Great Arab Revolt of the 1930s in Palestine. So like these solidarities against mutual colonizers are also like cross-African, cross-Wana, cross-Blad al-Sham kinds of solidarities. My own ancestry on my mom's side is Algerian, because there was a great migration of Algerians who fought the French that were coming to Syria to fight the French, So we've always like had these diasporas in different ways. And like we've always, that's been a part of who we are. Like Layla in the Land in Our Bones calls the Middle East the crossroads, because we really are the crossroads between so many different peoples and struggles. And like, there's just so much to excavate from our histories and learn for the future.
I think that's an amazing note to end on, actually. I don't know if Layla, you wanted to add anything.
No, I was thinking the same.
Banah, where can people find you, your work, that sort of thing? And of course, everything we've mentioned so far, we would include those in the show notes.
I'm like under the radar a little bit, but I'll drop my website because I'm always trying to hide from my family.
That's fine.
But yeah, and I'll share the Black Levantine Solidarity timeline that I made as well, because I've been excited about sharing more about that.
I'd love to hear more about that. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Fascinating.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Banah, of course. Layla as well. Thank you for hosting this. And this was another episode of Defy These Times. I hope everyone listening found that instructive. And if not, I mean, you've sat through this entire thing, so I don't know what's wrong with you. But no, I'm joking, of course. Thank you all for doing so. Thank you for doing this. Listeners, thanks as well as always. And see you next time.